The results revealed the significant social influence of the behavior of others in emergency situations. People who were alone were more likely to report the smoke than were those with other bystanders. Although 75% of the students who were alone reported the smoke, only 10% of students with the two passive Confederates responded in ways that ensured their safety. The passive behavior of the Confederates led many of the people who did not respond to interpret the situation as something other than critical. These people came to believe that nothing was wrong and therefore no action was necessary. Participants in this study used the behaviors of others as the basis for interpreting what was happening. To make sense out of this unusual situation, a room filling with smoke while others seemed unconcerned, some came up with creative explanations that could explain both the smoky substance and the seeming lack of concern of the other people in the room. They concluded that the smoke was truth gas being used by the experimenters to get them to answer the questions honestly. What about the condition with the 3 real participants and no Confederates to influence them? Because there were 3 people involved, you might expect that the likelihood that at least one of these 3 people would respond would be higher than the percentage of participants who took action when there was only one person present, 75%. Actually, only 38% of the time did any one of the participants take action in this condition. This is an illustration of a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance. Each participant, trying to stay cool, but also trying to understand what was happening, probably looked calm and unconcerned to the other 2 people. The outward calm of the other 2 participants then led each person to feel and act more calm, which in turn signaled to the other 2 participants that nothing was wrong. The group developed a shared illusion that the situation was not an emergency at all and that there was no need to take action. Of course, if this emergency had been real, these behaviors could have created an ironic situation in which 3 people would have died, apparently calmly. Although the presence of others typically inhibits intervention, that outcome is not inevitable. Because of informational social influence, what other people say and do are critical elements. When other bystanders act calm, they help define ambiguous situations as not emergencies. When other bystanders act alarmed, the likelihood that the situation will be interpreted as one requiring help will be increased. In one study by Irvin Staub, 1974, for instance, pairs of bystanders heard a crash in an adjoining room, followed by a female victim's cry for help. One of the bystanders was the experimenter's Confederate. His behavior was designed to influence how participants interpreted the situation. In one condition, the Confederate emphasized the possible seriousness of the situation by remarking, "That sounds bad, maybe we should do something," and then prepared to enter the adjacent room. In the other condition, the Confederate suggested to the other bystander that the situation really did not require assistance. "That sounds like a tape recording. Maybe they're trying to test us." Those people who heard the Confederate reinforce the severity of the situation helped 100% of the time. As expected from the social influence hypothesis, those people who heard the Confederate minimize the seriousness of the situation helped only 25% of the time. By comparison, when 2 naive participants were placed in this situation, help was given 60% of the time. Therefore, the presence of others can either facilitate or inhibit helping, depending on whether the actions or statements of these others suggest that help is or is not needed. In this context, let us return to the people who saved Reginald Denny's life. In the trial of the men charged with the attack, one of the rescuers testified that when she and her brother saw the beating on television, her brother looked at her and said, "We are Christians, we've got to go help him out." And I said, "Right." Then he went and got his keys. Without this exchange, Reginald Denny might have died. Clarity and need. We have demonstrated that whether a bystander interprets an event as a situation requiring assistance depends on both the clarity of the situation and the actions of other bystanders. How are these factors related? One hypothesis is that when a situation is ambiguous, people's desire to understand it leads them to look to others to define the situation. Conversely, when the event is unambiguous and the need for help is clear, bystanders will have less need to look to others for information and should therefore be less influenced by the reactions of other bystanders. Support for this reasoning comes from a study by Clark and Ward, 1972. In this experiment, male college students participated alone or in 2-person or 5-person groups. While students were filling out questionnaires, they witnessed an apparent university maintenance employee enter an adjacent room carrying a ladder and a set of Venetian blinds. After a few minutes, the students heard either an unambiguous or ambiguous emergency. In the unambiguous emergency, there was a loud crash and groans of pain. In the ambiguous emergency, there was a crash but no verbal cues indicating pain or need of assistance. As illustrated in Figure 3.3, the typical bystander effect, the inhibiting effect of the presence of others on helping, occurred for groups exposed to the ambiguous emergency. Students who were in 2- and 5-person groups were less likely to intervene than those who were alone. When the situation was unambiguous, however, the presence of others had no effect. Helping occurred in every case, regardless of the presence of others. For these participants, the emergency was so clear that there could only be one interpretation for what was happening. The victim was severely hurt, and assistance was needed immediately. Under these conditions, the presence of others had little impact on participants' interpretations and consequently had little effect on bystander response. Figure 3.3. The impact of informational social influence is stronger in ambiguous than in unambiguous situations. Also a reduction in pluralistic ignorance. Okay, so this is a side-by-side bar graph. The y-axis is the percent of bystanders helping from 0 to 100%, and the x-axis categories are divided into the unambiguous situation and the ambiguous situation. So, for the ambiguous situation, when people were alone or in 2-person groups or in 5-person groups, wow, they all helped 100% of the time. Whereas in the ambiguous situation, when they were alone, they helped about 40% of the time. In a 2-person group, they helped about 10% of the time. And in a 5-person group, they helped about 20% of the time. In ambiguous situations, then, people will seek social information to gain a better understanding of what is going on, and it is likely that they will be most influenced by those who are perceived to provide the most valid information. Specifically, social comparison theory, Festinger, 1954, suggests that people will be most influenced by the behaviors of others who are seen as similar to them. Similarity may be based on any number of dimensions that seem relevant in a given situation: similarity of attitudes, common background or preparation, comparable ability, proximity, or shared fate. Consistent with social comparison theory, Smith, and Lean, 1972, found that participants who were with another bystander, really Confederate, generally helped less often than participants who were alone, and the inhibiting effect of this other bystander was much greater when the participants believed the Confederate was similar to them than when they believed the Confederate was dissimilar. Bystanders were more likely to accept the no help needed definition implied by the Confederate's passive behavior when they believed that the Confederate was similar to themselves. The first 2 steps in the Latané and Darley model, i.e., noticing the event and interpreting it as a situation requiring assistance, are well supported by the research evidence, but do they explain the behavior of bystanders in the Kitty Genovese incident? Not entirely. The victim's screams brought people to their windows. They noticed the event. Many people also clearly saw the attack. They understood that she needed help. Because most people could not see the reactions of others who were in different apartments, however, it is unlikely that informational social influence distorted their perception of the victim's need for help. Although noticing the event and defining it as an emergency may increase the likelihood of intervention, there are additional decisions that must be made before people offer assistance. The next step in the Latané and Darley model involves the decision to take personal responsibility for helping. Step 3. Taking personal responsibility. When a person believes that he or she is the only witness to an emergency, the answer to the question, "Is it my responsibility to help?" is fairly obvious. The person bears 100% of the responsibility for helping and would bear 100% of the guilt and blame for not helping. Not surprisingly, people in these circumstances typically help. See Figure 3.3. However, when a bystander believes that other people are also witnessing the emergency and that these other people are also capable of helping, then the answer to the question concerning accepting personal responsibility is less obvious. If you believe that someone else will take action, then the assumption may relieve you from the responsibility of intervening. But what will happen if everyone believes that someone else will do it? Unfortunately, no one will do it, and that is presumably what occurred in the Kitty Genovese case. Diffusion of responsibility. The presence of others. Darley and Latané, 1968, devised a laboratory test of the Kitty Genovese incident to examine how the presumed presence of others can influence intervention even when no social information about the severity of the situation can possibly be conveyed through their actions or words. College students in separate cubicles discussed problems associated with living in an urban environment over an intercom system that allowed only one person to talk at a time. Participants were led to believe that their discussion group consisted of either 2 people, the participant and the future victim, 3 people, the participant, future victim, and 1 other, or 6 people, the participant, future victim, and 4 others. All group members except the 1 participant were actually on tape. A confederate of the experimenter played the role of the victim. Early in the discussion, the confederate casually mentioned that he had epilepsy and that the anxiety and stress resulting from living in a large city made him prone to seizures. Later, he became increasingly loud and incoherent, choking, gasping, and crying out before lapsing into silence. The critical question was whether helping would be affected by the number of bystanders the participants thought also heard the seizure. The number of other bystanders believed to be present when the victim had the seizure, just before the true participants' turn to talk, exerted a strong effect on the way the participants responded to this emergency. The more other bystanders the participant thought were present, the less likely the participants were to help. 85% of the participants who thought they were alone with the victim left their cubicles and tried to help before the end of the seizure, which lasted 3 minutes, but only 62% of the people who believed that 1 other bystander was available and 31% of those who thought that 4 others were present helped during this time period. Within 6 minutes after the seizure began, 100% of the bystanders who were alone, 81% of the people with 1 other presumed bystander, and 62% of the people with 4 other presumed bystanders attempted to help. Because bystanders could not see one another and therefore could not be misled by each other's inaction, social influence and pluralistic ignorance cannot account for the failure to intervene. Instead, the key factor seems to be whether bystanders would take personal responsibility. When other bystanders are present, diffusion of responsibility occurs. That is, people may feel less personally responsible for helping because they come to believe that others will intervene. This process seems to be the best explanation for the lack of action by the witnesses to the Kitty Genovese incident. The witnesses saw the lights in their neighbors' apartments and assumed that one of the other witnesses would call the police or go to Kitty Genovese's rescue. The diffusion of responsibility effect is a fundamental process in human behavior. Merely thinking about being with others may be sufficient to make people feel less personally accountable for helping, and thus less helpful in a subsequent situation. In a series of experiments, Garcia, Weaver, Moskowitz, and Darley, 2002, asked participants to imagine being with a friend at a restaurant or movie theater, or, alternatively, being with a friend at a crowded restaurant or movie theater. The researchers then examined the participants' subsequent responses to hypothetical and real helping situations. Participants who had been asked to imagine being in crowded social setting with a friend were less generous when later asked hypothetically how much money they would contribute to their university. Those who had thought about being in the crowded situation also gave less of their time when they were actually asked to volunteer to help another experimenter. In addition, thinking about a crowded social setting made people think less about being accountable, and this effect occurred over and above any feelings of discomfort related to imagining being in a crowded room. Consistent with the original diffusion of responsibility hypothesis, imagining being with many other people, relative to being with just one other person, made people less sensitive to their personal responsibility and subsequently less helpful to others. It's depersonalization in a crowd. It is important to emphasize that the inhibiting effect of the presence of others through diffusion of responsibility is not bystander apathy. In many cases, people may be truly concerned about the welfare of the victim, but they sincerely believe that someone else will help. Holding this belief, they do not have to assume personal responsibility and therefore do not help. One implication of this reasoning is that bystanders may diffuse responsibility when there are other witnesses who are capable of helping, but not when there are people who are incapable of helping. Leonard Bickman, 1971, conducted a direct test of this hypothesis. College students who believed that they either were the only bystander or were one of two bystanders heard an emergency over an intercom system. Participants who believed that the other bystander was as close to a victim as they were in the same building, and therefore equally capable of helping, diffused responsibility. They were much less likely to help than were participants who believed that they were alone. However, when participants believed that the other bystander was in another building and was unable to intervene, they helped as frequently as those who were alone. Therefore, people who diffuse responsibility are not necessarily uncaring. They may simply believe that others are more likely or perhaps better qualified to help. One way of preventing diffusion of responsibility from occurring, besides making it clear that others are not as capable as helping, is to focus responsibility onto one person. Although others are present, the responsibility for helping is often assumed to belong to the person in charge. For instance, have you ever asked a stranger to watch your possessions while you were gone for a short time? Have you ever wondered whether these people would actually protect your belongings? An experiment provides an answer. Moriarty, 1975. Confederates either asked sunbathers on a beach to watch their possessions while they went for a walk or, in a controlled condition, asked them for a match as they left for their walk. Soon after, a second Confederate wandered by, snatched a radio from the unoccupied blanket, and ran down the beach. For people who had agreed to accept responsibility, the response was impressive. 94% intervened, often in dramatic and physical fashion. By contrast, only 20% of the bystanders who were not explicitly made responsible tried to prevent the theft. Thus, once people assume positions of leadership in a group, agree to accept responsibility, or publicly state their intention to help, they are likely to intervene, even though other potential helpers are available. Situational standards. Situations bring with them a set of expectations about what behaviors are permissible and what ones are not. For instance, people are expected to behave differently in a place of worship, a library, a classroom, and a party. As people in emergency situations attempt to determine exactly what they should do, these situational standards of behavior, which are normally reasonable and functional, can significantly influence their decision to help, often in ways that appear somewhat unreasonable or irrational to outside observers. In a 1971 study, Staub established social rules by telling 7th grade students either that they were permitted to enter an adjacent room to take a break from the questionnaires they were completing, or that they were expressly prohibited from entering the room because they might influence each other's answers on the questionnaires. Later, the students heard an apparent emergency, an accident involving a person in the next room. Would 7th graders let the rule prohibiting them from entering that room prevent them from intervening? It would seem that the potential consequences to the victim for not being helped should outweigh the personal consequences to the bystander for violating the rule. In fact, because the reason for not entering the room, sharing answers with the person in the room, would no longer be relevant if an emergency was in progress, the prohibition was actually meaningless. Nevertheless, social rules still exerted a substantial effect. Although 91% of those who were given prior permission to enter the room offered help, only 45% of the 7th graders who were previously prohibited from entering the room offered help. Would adults act in the same way? In a subsequent study, Staub, 1971, showed that they do. Adults ages 18 to 28 years who were previously prohibited from entering the room so that the person working on a timed task would not be disturbed, were less likely to help than were participants permitted to enter the room to get a cup of coffee, 61% versus 89%. Once again, the social context strongly influenced a bystander's decision to take personal responsibility for intervention, the third step in the Latine and Darley model.